Richard Yates was born in 1926 in Yonkers, New York. He served in the United States Army during the Second World War, then worked a variety of jobs as he learned the craft of writing, selling his stories to Esquire, The Atlantic, Cosmopolitan, and other magazines. In 1961, his first novel, Revolutionary Road, was nominated for the National Book Award, and a collection of his stories, 11 Kinds of Loneliness, appeared the next year, winning the same extravagant praise as his previous book. During the 60s, he worked as a speechwriter for the U.S. Attorney General, adapted William Styron's novel Lie Down in Darkness to the screen, taught at the University of Iowa, and completed his second novel, A Special Providence, published in 1969. Since then, he has published another book of stories, Liars in Love, and 5 novels, Disturbing the Peace, Easter Parade, A Good School, Young Hearts Crying, and Cold Spring Harbor. He has won 2 Guggenheim Fellowships, 2 awards from the National Institute of Arts and Letters, a Brandeis University Creative Arts Award, grants from the Rockefeller Foundation and the NEA Lifetime Achievement Award. His fan club counts among its members Woody Allen, Ann Beattie, John Ciardi, Andre Dubus, Dorothy Parker, Robert Stone, John Updike, Kurt Vonnegut, Tennessee Williams, Tobias Wolff, and other people who inexplicably are better known than he is. However, 3 of his books, Revolutionary Road, The Easter Parade, and 11 Kinds of Loneliness, have recently been adopted by the Vintage Contemporary series, making him this year's hip young novelist. I've often thought that the best thing about learning how to write is that the lessons learned can make you not only a better writer, but a better person. Of course, this isn't always the case, but reading Richard Yates' novels and stories, I've learned again and again on every page that toughness and compassion need not be antithetical, and that real, unblinking honesty exacts a terrible price from writer and reader alike. Some time ago in an interview, Mr. Yates said, "Plain luck, after all, may be the one thing a good writer needs most." I think it probably is the hardest and loneliest profession in the world, this crazy, obsessive business of trying to be a good writer. None of us ever knows how much time he has left, or how well he'll be able to use that time, or whether, even if he does use his time well, his work will ever withstand and survive the terrible, inexorable indifference of time itself. If what he says is true, I have no doubt that Richard Yates is a lucky man, because his work will be with us for a very long time. So please welcome Richard Yates.
Thank you. I'm sorry about the air conditioner. You're very kind and brave to sit there in the heat. This won't take too long. Long enough, those the cigarette smokers among you will be excused if you want to duck out, as long as you come back in. Or the applause here. I'm going to read a story from my second book of short stories, Liars in Love. It's 10 years old. It's not a new story. But the only things I've got that are newer would be sections of novels, and I think for the purposes of a public reading, a story is preferable. So here we go. Look at that now. Can you all hear me well enough back there? You all can, good. The story is called Oh, Joseph, I'm So Tired. When Franklin D. Roosevelt was president-elect, there must have been sculptors all over America who wanted a chance to model his head from life, but my mother had connections. One of her closest friends and neighbors in the Greenwich Village courtyard where we lived was an amiable man named Howard Whitman, who had recently lost his job as a reporter on the New York Post. And one of Howard's former colleagues from the Post was now employed in the press office of Roosevelt, New York, our headquarters. That would make it easy for her to get in, or as she said, to get an entree. And she was confident she could take it from there. She was confident about everything she did in those days, but it never quite disguised a terrible need for support and approval on every side. She wasn't a very good sculptor. She had been working at it only for 3 years, since breaking up her marriage to my father, and there was still something stiff and amateurish about her pieces. Before the Roosevelt project, her specialty had been garden figures, a life-size little boy whose legs turned into the legs of a goat at the knee, and another who knelt among ferns to play the pipes of Pan. little girls who trailed chains of daisies from their upraised arms or walked beside a spread-winged goose. These fanciful children, in plaster painted green to simulate weathered bronze, were arranged on homemade wooden pedestals to loom around her studio and to leave a cleared space in the middle for the modeling stand that held whatever she was working on in clay. Her idea was that any number of rich people, all of them gracious and aristocratic, would soon discover her. They would want her sculpture to decorate their landscape gardens, and they would want to make her their friend for life. In the meantime, a little nationwide publicity as the first woman sculptor to do the president-elect certainly wouldn't hurt her career. And if nothing else, she had a good studio. It was, in fact, the best of all the studios she would have in the rest of her life. There were 6 or 8 old houses facing our side of the courtyard, with their backs to Bedford Street. And ours was probably the showplace of the row, because the front room of its ground floor was 2 stories high. You went down a broad set of brick steps to the tall front windows and the front door. Then you were in the high, wide, light-flooded studio. It was big enough to serve as a living room, too, and so along with the green garden children, it contained all the living room furniture from the house we'd lived in with my father in the suburban town of Hastings-on-Hudson, where I was born. A second-floor balcony ran along the far end of the studio with 2 small bedrooms and a tiny bathroom tucked away upstairs. Beneath that, where the ground floor continued through to the Bedford Street side, lay the only part of the apartment that might let you know we didn't have much money. The ceiling was very low and it was always dark in there. The small windows looked out underneath an iron sidewalk grating, and the bottom of that street cavity was thick with strewn garbage. Our roach-infested kitchen was barely big enough for a stove and a sink that were never clean, and for a brown wooden icebox with its dark, ever-melting block of ice. The rest of that area was our dining room, and not even the amplitude of the old Hastings dining room table could brighten it. But our majestic radio was in there too, and that made it a cozy place for my sister Edith and me. We liked the children's programs that came on in the late afternoons. We had just turned off the radio one day when we went out to the studio and found our mother discussing the Roosevelt Project with Howard Whitman. It was the first we'd heard of it, and we must have interrupted her with too many questions because she said, "Edith, Billy, that's enough now. I'll tell you all about this later. Run out in the garden and play." She always called the courtyard the garden, though nothing grew there except a few stunted city trees and a patch of grass that never had a chance to spread. Mostly it was bald earth, interrupted here and there by a brick paving, lightly powdered with soot and scattered with the droppings of dogs and cats. It may have been 6 or 8 houses long, but it was only 2 houses wide, which gave it a hemmed-in, cheerless look. Its only point of interest was a dilapidated marble fountain, not much bigger than a bird bath, which stood near our house. The original idea of the fountain was that water would drip evenly from around the rim of its upper tier and tinkle into its lower basin. But age had unsettled it. The water spilled in a single ropey stream from the only inch of the upper tier's rim that always stayed clean. The lower basin was deep enough to soak your feet in on a hot day, but there wasn't much pleasure in that because the underwater part of the marble was coated with brown scum. My sister and I found things to do in the courtyard every day for all the 2 years we lived there, but that was only because Edith was an imaginative child. She was 11 at the time of the Roosevelt Project, and I was 7. "Daddy," she asked in our father's office uptown one afternoon, "have you heard Mommy's doing ahead of President Roosevelt?" Oh, he was rummaging in his desk, looking for something he said we might like. She's going to take his measurements and stuff here in New York, Edith said. And then after the inauguration, when the sculpture is done, she's going to take it to Washington and present it to him in the White House. Edith often told one of our parents about the other's more virtuous activities. It was part of her long, hopeless effort to bring them back together. Many years later, she told me she thought she had never recovered and never would from the shock of their breakup. She said Hastings-on-Hudson remained the happiest time of her life. And that made me envious, because I could scarcely remember it at all. Well, my father said, that's really something, isn't it? Then he found what he'd been looking for in the desk and said, here we go. What do you think of these? They were two fragile perforated sheets of what looked like postage stamps. Each stamp bearing the insignia of an electric light bulb in vivid white against a yellow background, and the words, more light. My father's office was one of many small cubicles on the 23rd floor of the General Electric building. He was an assistant regional sales manager in what was then called the Man of the Lamp division. A modest job, but good enough to have allowed him to rent into a town like Hastings-on-Hudson in better times. And these more light stamps were souvenirs of a recent sales convention. We told him the stamps were neat, and they were, but expressed some doubt as to what we might do with them. Oh, they're just for decoration, he said. I thought you could paste them into your school books or, you know, whatever you want. Ready to go? And he carefully folded the sheets of stamps and put them in his inside pocket for safekeeping on the way home. Between the subway exit and the courtyard, somewhere in the West Village, we always passed a vacant lot where men stood huddled around weak fires built of broken fruit crates and trash, some of them trying to warm cans of food. Don't stare, my father said the first time. All those men are out of work and they're hungry. Daddy, Edith inquired, do you think Roosevelt's good? Sure I do. Do you think all the Democrats are good? Well, most of them, sure. Much later, I would learn that my father had participated in local Democratic Party politics for years. He had served some of his political friends, men my mother described as dreadful little Irish people from Tammany Hall, by helping them to establish Mazda lamp distributorships in various parts of the city. And he loved their social gatherings, at which he was often asked to sing. Well, of course, you're too young to remember Daddy singing He Told Me once, after his death in 1942. No, I'm not, I remember. But I mean really remember, she said. He has the most beautiful tenor voice I've ever heard. Remember Danny Boy? Sure. Ah, God, that was something, she said, closing her eyes. That was really something. When we got back to the courtyard that afternoon and back into the studio, Edith and I watched our parents say hello to each other. We always watched that closely, hoping they might drift into conversation and sit down together and find things to laugh about, but they never did. And it was even less likely than usual today because my mother had a guest, a woman called Sloan Cabot, who was her best friend in the courtyard and who greeted my father with a little rush of false, flirtatious enthusiasm. Have you been, Sloan? He said. Then he turned back to his former wife and said, Helen, I hear you're planning to make a bust of Roosevelt. Well, not a bust, she said, a head. I think it'll be more effective if I cut it off at the neck. Well, that's good. That's fine. Good luck with it. Okay, then. He gave his whole attention to Edith and me. Okay, see you soon. How about a hug? And those hugs of his, the climax of his visitation rites, were unforgettable. One at a time, we would be swept up and pressed hard into the smells of linen and whiskey and tobacco. The warm rasp of his jaw would graze one cheek, and there would be a quick, moist kiss near the ear, then he'd let us go. He was almost all the way out of the courtyard, almost out on the street, when Edith and I went racing after him. "Daddy, Daddy, you forgot the stamps." He stopped and turned around, and that was when we saw he was crying. He tried to hide it. He put his face nearly into his armpit, as if that might help him search his inside pocket. But there is no way to disguise the awful bloat and pucker of a face in tears. "Here," he said, "here you go." And he gave us a very unconvincing smile. It would be good to report that we stayed and talked to him, that we hugged him again, but we were too embarrassed for that. We took the stamps and ran home without looking back. "Oh, aren't you excited, Helen?" Sloan Cabot was saying. "To be meeting him and talking to him and everything in front of all those reporters?" "Well, of course," my mother said, "but the important thing is to get the measurements right. I hope there won't be too many photographers with silly interruptions." Sloan Cabot was some years younger than my mother and strikingly pretty in a style often portrayed in what I think are called Art Deco illustrations of that period. Straight dark bangs, big eyes, and a big mouth. She too was a divorced mother, though her former husband had vanished long ago and was referred to only as that bastard or that cowardly son of a bitch. Her only child was a boy of Edith's age named John, whom Edith and I liked enormously. The two women had met within days of our moving into the courtyard, and their friendship was sealed when my mother solved the problem of John's schooling. She knew a Hastings-on-Hudson family who would appreciate the money earned from taking in a boarder. So John went up there to live and go to school and came home only on weekends. The arrangement cost more than Sloan could comfortably afford, but she managed to make ends meet and was forever grateful. Sloan worked in the Wall Street district as a private secretary. She talked a lot about how she hated her job and her boss, but the good part was that her boss was often out of town for extended periods. That gave her time to use the office typewriter in pursuit of her life's ambition, which was to write scripts for the radio. She once confided to my mother that she'd made up both of her names. Sloan, because it sounded masculine, the kind of name a woman alone might need for making her way in the world. And Cabot, because it had a touch of class. Was there anything wrong with that? "Oh, Helen," she said, "this is going to be wonderful for you. If you get the publicity, if the papers pick it up, and the newsreels, you'll be one of the most interesting personalities in America." 5 or 6 people were gathered in the studio on the day my mother came home from her first visit with the president-elect. "Will somebody get me a drink?" she asked, looking around in mock helplessness. "Then I'll tell you all about it." And with the drink in her hand, with her eyes as wide as a child's, she told us how a door had opened and 2 big men had brought him in. Big men, she insisted. Young, strong men, holding him up under the arms, and you could see how they were straining. Then you saw this foot come out with these awful metal braces on the shoe, and then the other foot. And he was sweating, and he was panting for breath, and his face was, I don't know, all bright and tense and horrible. She shuddered. "Well," Howard Whitman said, looking uneasy, "you can't help being crippled, Helen." "Howard," she said impatiently, "I'm only trying to tell you how ugly it was." And that seemed to carry a certain weight. If she was an authority on beauty, on how a little boy might kneel among ferns to play the pipes of Pan, for example, then surely she had earned the credentials as an authority on ugliness. "Anyway," she went on, "they got him into a chair, and he wiped the sweat off his face with a handkerchief. He was still out of breath. And after a while, he started talking to some of the other men around there. Some of the other men there. I couldn't follow that part of it. Then finally he turned to me with this smile of his. Honestly, I don't know if I can describe that smile. It isn't something you can see in the newsreels. You have to be there. His eyes don't change at all, but the corners of his mouth go up as if they're being pulled by puppet strings. It's a frightening smile. It makes you think, This could be a dangerous man. This could be an evil man. Well, anyway, we started talking, and I spoke right up to him. I said, I didn't vote for you, Mr. President. I said, I'm a good Republican, and I voted for President Hoover. He said, what are you doing here then? Or something like that. And I said, because you have a very, what? I came here because you have a very interesting head. So he gave me the smile again and said, what's interesting about it? And I said, I like the bumps on it. By then, she must have assumed that every reporter in the room was writing in his notebook while the photographers got their flash bulbs ready. Tomorrow's papers might easily read, Gal sculptor quits FDR about bumps on head. At the end of her preliminary chat with him, she got down to business, which was to measure the different parts of his head with her calipers. I knew how that felt. The cold, trembling points of those clay-encrusted calipers had tickled and poked me all over during the times I'd served as a model for her phase little Woodland boys. But not a flash bulb went off while she took and recorded his measurements, and nobody asked her any questions. After a few nervous words of thanks and goodbye, she was out in the corridor again among all the helpless craning people who couldn't get in. It must have been a bad disappointment, and I imagine she tried to make up for it by planning the triumphant way she'd tell us about it when she got home. Helen, Howard Whitman inquired after most of the other visitors had gone, why did you tell me you didn't vote for him? Well, because it's true. I'm a good Republican. You know that. She was a storekeeper's daughter from a small town in Ohio. She had probably grown up hearing the phrase good Republican as an index of respectability and clean clothes. And maybe she had come to relax her standards of respectability. Maybe she didn't care about clean clothes anymore, but good Republican was worth clinging to. It would be helpful when she met the customers for her garden figures, the people whose low, courteous voices would welcome into their lives, and who would almost certainly turn out to be Republicans too. I believe in the aristocracy, she often cried, trying to make herself heard over the rumble of voices when her guests were discussing communism, and they seldom paid her any attention. They liked her well enough. She gave parties with plenty of liquor, and she was an agreeable hostess, if only because of her touching eagerness to please. But in any talk of politics, she was like a shrill, exasperating child. She believed in the aristocracy. She believed in God, too, or at least in the ceremony of St. Luke's Episcopal Church, which she attended once or twice a year. And she believed in Eric Nicholson, the handsome, middle-aged Englishman who was her lover. He had something to do with the American end of a British chain of foundries. His company cast ornamental objects into bronze and lead, the cupolas of college and high school buildings all over the East, the lead casement windows for Tudor-style homes in places like Scarsdale and Bronxville. These were some of the things Eric Nicholson's firm had accomplished. He was always self-deprecating about his business, but ready and glowing with its success. My mother had met him the year before when she sought help in having one of her garden figures cast into bronze to be placed on consignment with some garden sculpture gallery from which it would never be sold. Eric Nicholson had persuaded her that lead would be almost as nice as bronze and much cheaper. And then he'd ask her out to dinner, and that evening changed our lives. Mr. Nicholson rarely spoke to my sister or me, and I think we were both frightened of him, but he almost overwhelmed us with gifts. At first there were books, a volume of cartoons from Punch, a partial set of Dickens, a book called England in Tudor Times, containing tissue-covered color plates that Edith liked. But in the summer of 1933, when our father arranged for us to spend 2 weeks at the lake with our mother at a small lake in New Jersey, Mr. Nicholson's gifts became a cornucopia of sporting goods. He gave Edith a steel fishing rod with a reel so intricate that none of us could have figured it out, even if we'd known how to fish. A wicker creel for carrying the fish she would never catch, and a sheathed hunting knife to be worn at her waist. He gave me a short axe whose head was encased in a leather holster and strapped to my belt. I guess this was for cutting the firewood to cook the fish, and a cumbersome net with a handle that hung from an elastic shoulder strap in case I should be called upon to wade in and help Edith land a tricky one. There was nothing to do in that New Jersey village except take long walks, or what my mother called good hikes. And every day, as we plodded out through the insect humming weeds in the sun, we wore our full regalia of useless equipment. That same summer, Mr. Nicholson gave me a 3-year subscription to Field and Stream, and I think that impenetrable magazine was the least appropriate of all his gifts, because it kept coming in the mail for such a long, long time, after everything else had changed for us again, as we had moved out of New York to Scarsdale, where Mr. Nicholson had found a house with a low rent, and after he'd abandoned my mother in that house with no warning, to return to England and to the wife from whom he'd never really been divorced. But all that came later. I want to go back to the time between Franklin D. Roosevelt's election and his inauguration, when his head was slowly taking shape on my mother's modeling stand. Her original plan had been to make it life-size, or larger than life-size, but Mr. Nicholson urged her to scale it down for economy in the casting, and so she made it only 6 or 7 inches high. He persuaded her, too, for the second time since he'd known her, that lead would be almost as nice as bronze. She had always said she didn't mind at all if Edith and I watched her work, but we had never much wanted to. Now it was a little more interesting because we could watch her sift through many photographs of Roosevelt, cut from newspapers until she found one that would help her execute a subtle plane of cheek or brow. But most of our day was taken up with school. Sean Cabot might go to school in Hastings-on-Hudson, for which Edith would always yearn, but we had what even Edith admitted wasn't like the best thing. We went to school in our bedroom. During the previous year, my mother had enrolled us in the public school down the street, but she'd begun to regret it when we came home with lice in our hair. Then one day Edith came home, accused of having stolen a boy's coat, and that was too much. She withdrew us both, in defiance of the city truant officer, and pleaded with my father to help her meet the cost of a private school. He refused. The rent she paid and the bills she ran up were already taxing him far beyond the terms of the divorce agreement. He was in debt. Surely she must realize he was lucky even to have a job. Would she ever learn to be reasonable? It was Howard Whitman who broke the deadlock. He knew of an inexpensive, fully accredited mail-order service called the Calvert School, intended mainly for the homes of children who were invalids. The Calvert School furnished weekly supplies of books and materials and study plans. All she would need was someone in the house to administer the program and to serve as a tutor, and someone like Bart Compton would be ideal for the job. The skinny fellow, she said, the Jewish boy from Holland or wherever it is. He's very well educated, Helen, Howard told her, and he speaks fluent English, and he'd be very conscientious, and he could certainly use the money. We were delighted to learn that Bart Compton would be our tutor. With the exception of Howard himself, Bart was probably our favorite among all the adults around the courtyard. He was 28 or so, young enough so that his ears could still turn red when he was teased by children. We had found that out in teasing him once or twice about such matters as that his socks didn't match. He was tall and very thin, and seemed always to look startled except when he was comforted enough to smile. He was a violinist, a Dutch Jew who had emigrated to this country the year before in the hope of joining a symphony orchestra and eventually of launching a concert career. But the symphonies weren't hiring then, nor were lesser orchestras, so Bart had gone without work for a long time. He lived alone in a room on 7th Avenue, not far from the courtyard, and people who liked him used to worry that he might not have enough to eat. He owned 2 suits, both cut in a way that must have been stylish in the Netherlands at that time. Stiff, heavily padded shoulders with a nipped-in waist. They would probably have looked better on someone with a little more meat on his bones. In shirt sleeves, with the cuffs rolled back, his hairy wrists and forearms looked even more fragile than you might have expected, but his long hands were shapely and strong enough to suggest authority on the violin. "I'll leave it entirely up to you, Bart," my mother said when he asked if she had any instructions for our tutoring. "I know you'll do wonders with them." A small table was moved into our bedroom under the window and 3 chairs placed around it. Bart sat in the middle so that he could divide his time equally between Edith and me. Big, clean, heavy brown envelopes arrived in the mail from the Calvert School once a week, and when Bart slid their fascinating contents under the table, it was like settling down to begin a game. Edith was in the 5th grade that year. Her part of the table was given over to incomprehensible talk about English and history and social studies, and I was in the 1st. I spent my mornings asking Bart to help me puzzle out the very opening moves of an education. "Take your time, Billy," he would say. "Don't get impatient with this. Once you have it, you'll see how easy it is, and then you'll be ready for the next thing." At 11 each morning, we would take a break. We'd go downstairs and out to the part of the courtyard that had a little grass. Bart would carefully lay his folded coat on the sidelines, turn back his shirt cuffs, and present himself as ready to give what he called airplane rides. Taking us one at a time, he would grasp one wrist, one ankle, then he'd whirl us off our feet and around, with himself as the pivot, until the courtyard and the buildings and the city and the sky were lost forever. And the world were lost in the dizzying blur of our flight. After the airplane rides, we would hurry down the steps into the studio, where we'd usually find that my mother had set out a tray bearing 3 tall glasses of Ovaltine, sometimes with cookies on the side and sometimes not. I once overheard her telling Sloan Cabot she thought the Ovaltine must be Bart's first nourishment of the day. I think she was probably right, if only because of the way his hand would tremble in reaching for his glass. Sometimes she'd forget to prepare the tray, and we'd crowd into the kitchen and fix it ourselves. I could never see a jar of Ovaltine on the grocery shelf without remembering those times. Then it was back upstairs to school again, and during that year, by coaxing and prodding and telling me not to get impatient, Bart Compton taught me to read. It was an excellent opportunity for showing off. I would pull books down from my mother's shelves, mostly books that were the gifts of Mr. Nicholson, and try to impress her by reading mangled sentences aloud. "That's wonderful, dear," she would say. "You've really learned to read, haven't you?" Soon a white and yellow more light stamp was affixed to every page of my Calvert 1st grade reader, proving I had mastered it, and others were accumulating at a slower rate in my arithmetic workbook. Still other stamps were fastened to the wall beside my place at the school table, arranged in a proud little white and yellow thumb-smudged column that rose as high as I could reach. "You shouldn't have put your stamps on the wall," Edith said. "Why?" "Well, because it'll be hard to take off." Who's going to take them off? That small room of ours, with its double function of sleep and learning, stands more clearly in my memory than any other part of our home. Someone should probably have told my mother that a girl and boy of our ages ought to have separate rooms, but that never occurred to me until much later. Our cots were set foot to foot against the wall, leaving just enough space to pass alongside them to the school table, and we had some good conversations as we lay waiting for sleep at night. The one I remember best was the time Edith told me about the sound of the city. "I don't mean just the loud noises," she said, "like that siren going by just now, or the car doors slamming, or all the laughing and shouting up the street. That's just close-up stuff. I'm talking about something else, because you see, there are millions and millions of people in New York, more people than you can possibly imagine ever, and most of them are doing something that makes a sound. Maybe talking or playing the radio, maybe closing doors, maybe putting their forks down on their plates if they're having dinner, or dropping their shoes if they're going to bed. And because there are so many of them, all those little sounds add up and come together in a kind of hum. but it's so faint, so very, very faint, that you can't hear it unless you listen very carefully for a long time. Can you hear it? I asked her. Sometimes. I listen every night, but I can only hear it sometimes. Other times I fall asleep. Let's be quiet now and just listen. See if you can hear it, Billy. And I tried hard, closing my eyes as if that would help, opening my mouth to minimize the sound of my breathing, but in the end I had to tell her that I'd failed. How about you, she said. I asked. Oh, I heard it, she said. Just for a few seconds, but I heard it. You'll hear it too if you keep trying. And it's worth waiting for. When you hear it, you're hearing the whole city of New York. The high point of our week was Friday afternoon when John Cabot came home from Hastings. He exuded health and normality. He brought fresh suburban air into our bohemian lives. He even transformed his mother's small apartment while he was there into an enviable place of rest between vigorous encounters with the world. He subscribed to both Boys' Life and Open Road for Boys, and these seemed to me to be wonderful things to have in your house, if only for the illustration. John dressed in the same heroic way as the boys shown in those magazines, corduroy knickers with ribbed stockings pulled taut over his muscular calves. He talked a lot about the Hastings High School football team, for which he planned to try out as soon as he was old enough, and about Hastings friends whose names and personalities grew almost as familiar to us as if they were friends of our own. He taught us invigorating new ways to speak, like saying, "What's the diff?" instead of "What's the difference?" And he was better even than Edith at finding new things to do in the courtyard. You could buy goldfish for 10 or 15 cents apiece in Woolworths then, and one day we brought 3 of them home to keep in the fountain. We sprinkled the water with more Woolworths granulated fish food than they could possibly need, and we named them after ourselves, John, Edith, and Billy. For a week or two, Edith and I would run to the fountain every morning before Bart came for school to make sure they were still alive and to see if they had enough food and to watch them. Have you noticed how much bigger Billy's getting? Edith asked me. He's huge. He's almost as big as John and Edith now. He'll probably be bigger than both of them. Then one weekend when John was home, he called our attention to how quickly the fish could turn and move. They have better reflexes than humans, he explained. When they see a shadow in the water or anything that looks like danger, they can get away faster than you can blink. Watch. And he sank one hand in the water to make a grab for the fish named Edith, but she evaded him and fled. See that? He said, how's that for speed? Know something? I bet you could shoot an arrow in there, and they'd get away in time. Wait. To prove his point, he ran to his mother's apartment and came back with a handsome bow and arrow that he'd made in summer camp. Going to camp every summer was another admirable thing about John. Then he knelt at the rim of the fountain like the picture of an archer. His bow steady in one strong hand and the feathered end of his arrow tight against the bowstring in the other. He was taking aim at a fish named Billy. Now, the velocity of this arrow, he said in a voice weakened with his effort, is probably more than a car going 80 miles an hour. It's probably more like an airplane, or maybe even more than that. Okay, watch. The fish named Billy was suddenly floating dead on the surface. On his side, impaled a quarter of the way up the arrow with parts of his pink guts dribbled along the shaft. I was too old to cry, but something had to be done about the shock and rage and grief as I ran from the fountain, heading blindly for home, and halfway there, I came upon my mother. She stood looking very clean, wearing a new coat and dress I'd never seen before, and fastened to the arm of Mr. Nicholson. They were either just going out, or just coming in. I didn't care which. And Mr. Nicholson frowned at me. He had told me more than once that boys of my age were sent to boarding school in England. But I didn't care about that either. I bent my head into her waist and didn't stop crying until long after I felt her hand stroking my back, until after she'd assured me that goldfish didn't cost much, and I'd have another one soon, and that John was sorry for the thoughtless thing he'd done. I had discovered or rediscovered that crying is a pleasure, that it can be a pleasure beyond all reckoning if your head is pressed in your mother's waist and her hands are on your back, and if she happens to be wearing clean clothes. There were other pleasures. We had a good Christmas Eve in our house that year, or at least it was good at first. My father was there, which obliged Mr. Nicholson to stay away. And it was nice to see how relaxed he was among my mother's friends. He was shy, but they seemed to like him. He got along especially well with Bart Compton. Howard Whitman's daughter, Molly, a sweet-natured girl of about my age, had come in from Tarrytown to spend the holidays with him, and there were several other children whom we knew but rarely saw. John looked very mature that night in a dark coat and tie, plainly aware of his social responsibilities as the oldest boy. After a while, with no plan, the party drifted back into the dining room area and staged an impromptu vaudeville. Howard started it. He brought the tall stool from my mother's modeling stand and sat his daughter on it, facing the audience. He folded back the opening of a brown paper bag 2 or 3 times and fitted it onto her head. Then he took off his suit coat and draped it around her shoulder backwards, up to the chin. He went behind her, crouched out of sight, and worked his hands through the coat sleeves so that when they emerged they appeared to be hers. And the sight of a smiling little girl in a paper bag hat, waving and gesturing with huge expressive hands, was enough to make everyone laugh. The big hands wiped her eyes and stroked her chin and pushed her hair behind her ears. Then they elaborately thumbed her nose at us. Next came Sloan Cabot. She sat very straight on the stool with her heels hooked over the rungs in such a way as to show her good legs to their best advantage. But her first act didn't go over. Well, she began, I was at work today. You know my office is on the 40th floor. When I happened to glance up from my typewriter and saw this big old man sort of crouched on the ledge outside the window with a white beard and a funny red suit. So I ran to the window and opened it and said, "Are you all right?" Well, it was Santa Claus. And he said, "Of course I'm all right. I'm used to high places, but listen, miss, can you direct me to number 75 Bedford Street?" There was more, but our embarrassed looks must have told her we knew we were being condescended to. As soon as she'd found a way to finish it, she did so quickly. Then, after a thoughtful pause, she tried something else that turned out to be much better. "Have you children ever heard the story of the first Christmas?" she asked, "when Jesus was born?" And she began to tell it in the kind of hushed, dramatic voice she must have hoped might be used by the narrators of her more serious radio plays. And there were still many miles to go before they reached Bethlehem, she said, and it was a cold night. Now, Mary knew she would very soon have a baby. She even knew, because an angel had told her, that her baby might one day be the savior of all mankind. But she was only a young girl. Here Sloan's eyes glistened with tears, and the traveling had exhausted her. She was bruised by the jolting gait of the donkey, and she ached all over, and she thought they'd never, ever get there. And all she could say was, "Oh, Joseph, I'm so tired." The story went on through the rejection at the inn, and the birth in the stable, and the manger, and the animals, and the arrival of the 3 kings. When it was over, we clapped a long time because Sloan had told it so well. "Daddy," Edith said, "will you sing to us? Will you sing for us?" "Oh, well, thanks, honey," he said, "but no, I really need a piano for that. Thanks anyway." And so the final performer of the evening was Bart Campbell, persuaded by a popular demand to go home and get his violin. There was no surprise in discovering that he played like a professional, like something you might easily hear on the radio. The enjoyment came from watching how his thin face frowned over the chin rest, empty of all emotion, except concern that the sound be right. We were proud of him. Sometime after my father left, a good many other adults began to arrive, most of them strangers to me, looking as though they'd already attended several other parties that night. It was very late, or rather, very early Christmas morning, when I looked into the kitchen and saw Sloan standing close to a bald man. I didn't know, a bald man I didn't know. She turned a trembling, he held a trembling freak in one hand and slowly massaged her shoulder with the other. She seemed to be shrinking back against the old wooden icebox. Sloan had a way of smiling that allowed little wisps of cigarette smoke to escape from between her almost closed lips, while she looked you up and down, and she was doing that. Then the man put his drink on top of the icebox and took her in his arms, and I couldn't see her face anymore. Another man in a rumpled brown suit lay unconscious on the dining room floor. I walked around him and went into the studio, where a good-looking young woman stood weeping wretchedly, and three men kept getting in each other's way as they tried to comfort her. Then I saw that one of the men was Bart, and I watched while he outlasted the other two and turned the girl away through the door. He put his arm around her, and she nestled her head in his shoulder. That was how they left the house. Edith looked jaded in her wrinkled party dress. She was reclining on her old Hastings easy chair, with her head tipped back and her legs flung out over both the chair's arms, and John sat cross-legged on the floor near one of her dangling feet. They seemed to have been talking about something that didn't interest either of them very much, and the talk died out altogether when I sat on the floor to join them. "Billy," she said, "do you realize what time it is?" "What's the diff?" I said. "You should have been in bed hours ago. Come on, let's go up." "I don't feel like it." "Well," she said, "I'm going up anyway." And she got laboriously out of the chair and walked away into the crowd. John turned to me and narrowed his eyes unpleasantly. "Know something?" he asked. "When she was in the chair that way, I could see everything." "Huh?" "I could see everything. I could see the crack and the hair. She's beginning to get hair." I'd observed these features of my sister several times, in the bathtub or when she was changing her clothes, and hadn't found them especially remarkable. Even so, I understood at once how remarkable they must have been for him. If only he had smiled in a bashful way, we might have laughed together like a couple of regular fellows out of Open Road for Boys. But his face was still set in that disdainful look. I kept looking and looking. He said, and I had to keep her talking so she wouldn't catch on. But I was doing fine until you had to come over and wreck it and ruin it. Was I supposed to apologize? That didn't seem right, but nothing else seemed right either. All I did was look at the floor. When I finally got to bed that night, there was scarcely time for trying to hear the elusive sound of the city. I had found that a good way to keep from thinking of anything else. When my mother came blundering in, she'd had too much to drink and wanted to lie down, but instead of going to her own room, she got into bed with me. "Oh," she said, "oh my boy, oh my boy." It was a narrow cot, and there was no way to make room for her. Then suddenly she retched, bolted to her feet, and ran to the bathroom where I heard her vomiting. And when I moved over to the bed she had occupied, my face recoiled quickly, but not quite in time, from the slick mouthful of puke she had left on her side of the pillow. For a month or so that winter, we didn't see much of Sloan, because she said she was working on something big, something really big. When it was finished, she brought it to the studio, looking tired but prettier than ever, and shyly asked if she could read it aloud. "Wonderful," my mother said. "What's it about?" "That's the best part. It's about us. All of us. Listen." Bart had gone for the day, and Edith was out in the courtyard by herself. She often played by herself. So there was nobody in the for an audience but my mother and me. We sat on the sofa, and Sloan arranged herself on a tall stool, just as she'd done for telling the Bethlehem story. "There is an enchanted courtyard in Greenwich Village," she began. "It's only a narrow patch of brick and green among the irregular shapes of very old houses. But what makes it enchanted is that the people who live there, who live in it or near it, have come to form an enchanted circle of friends. None of them have much money, and some of them are quite poor. But they believe in the future, they believe in each other, and in themselves. There is Howard, once a top reporter on a metropolitan daily newspaper. Everyone knows Howard will soon scale the journalistic heights again, and in the meantime, he serves as the wise and humorous sage of the courtyard. There is Bart, a young violinist clearly destined for virtuosity on the concert stage, who, just for the present, must graciously accept all lunch and dinner invitations in order to survive. And there is Helen, a sculptor whose charming works will someday grace the finest gardens in America, and whose studio is the favorite gathering place for members of the circle. There was more like that, introducing other characters, and toward the end she got around to the children. She described my sister as a lanky, dreamy tomboy, which was odd. I'd never thought of Edith that way. And she called me a sad-eyed, 7-year-old philosopher, which was wholly baffling. When the introduction was over, she paused a few seconds for dramatic effect, and then went into the opening episode of the series, or what I suppose would be called the pilot. I couldn't follow the story very well. It seemed to be mostly an excuse for bringing each character up to the microphone for a few lines apiece. And before long, I was listening only to see if there would be any lines from the character based on me. And there were, in a way. She announced my name, Billy, but then instead of speaking, she put her mouth through a terrible series of contortions, accompanied by a funny little burst of sound, and by the time the words came out, I didn't care what they were. It was true that I stuttered badly. I wouldn't get over it for 5 or 6 more years, but I hadn't expected anyone to put it on the radio. "Oh, Sloan, that's marvelous," my mother said when the reading was over. "That's really exciting." And Sloan was carefully stacking her typed pages in a way she'd probably been taught to do in secretarial school, blushing and smiling with pride, while she said, "It probably needs work, but I think it's got a lot of potential." "It's perfect," my mother said, "just the way it is." Sloan mailed the script to a radio producer, and he mailed it back with a letter typed by some radio secretary, explaining that her material had too limited an appeal to be commercial. The radio public was not yet ready, he said, for a story of Greenwich Village life. Then it was March. The new president promised that the only thing we had to fear was fear itself, and soon after that his head came packed in wood and excelsior from Mr. Nicholson's foundry. It was a fairly good likeness. She had caught the famous lift of the chin. It might not have looked like him at all if she hadn't, and everyone told her it was fine. What nobody said was that her original plan had been right and Mr. Nicholson shouldn't have interfered. It was too small. It didn't look heroic. If you could have hollowed it out and put a slot on the top, it might easily have made a serviceable night for loose change. The foundry had burnished the lead until it shone almost silver in the highlights, and they'd mounted it on a sturdy little base of heavy black plastic. They had sent back 3 copies, one for the White House presentation, one to keep for exhibition purposes, and an extra one. But the extra one soon toppled to the floor and was badly damaged, the nose mashed almost into the chin, and my mother might have burst into tears if Howard Whitman hadn't made everyone laugh by saying it was now a good portrait of Vice President Garner. Charlie Hines, Howard's old friend from the Post, who was now a minor member of the White House staff, made an appointment for my mother with the president late on a weekday morning. She arranged for Sloan to spend the night with Edith and me. Then she took an evening train down to Washington, carrying the sculpture in a cardboard box, and stayed at one of the less expensive Washington hotels. In the morning, she met Charlie Hines in some crowded White House anteroom, where I guess they disposed of the cardboard box, and he took her to the waiting room outside the Oval Office. He sat with her as she held the naked head on her lap, and when their turn came, he escorted her into the president's desk. For the presentation, it didn't take long. There were no reporters and no photographers. Afterwards, Charlie Hines took her out to lunch, probably because he promised Howard Whitman to do so. I imagine it wasn't a first-class restaurant, more likely some bustling, no-nonsense place favored by the working press. And I imagine they had trouble making conversation until they settled on Howard. And what a shame it was that he was still out of work. No, but do you know Howard's friend Bart Campen? Charlie asked. The young Dutchman? The violinist? Yes, certainly, she said. I know Bart. Well, Jesus, there's one story with a happy ending, right? Have you heard about that? Last time I saw Bart, he said, Charlie, the pressure's over me. And he told me he found some rich, dumb, crazy woman who was paying him to tutor her kids. There would be no photographers. There would be no photographs or interviews or feature articles, no thrilling moments of newsreel coverage. Strangers would never know of how she'd come from a small Ohio town, or of how she'd measured her talent through the brave, difficult, one-woman journey that had brought her to the attention of the world. It wasn't fair. All she had to look forward to now was her romance with Eric Nicholson, and I think she may have known even then that it was faltering. His final desertion came the next fall. She was 42, an age when even romantics must admit that youth is gone. And she had nothing to show for the years but a studio crowded with green plaster statues that nobody would buy. She she believed in the aristocracy, but there was no reason to suppose the aristocracy would ever believe in her. And every time she thought of what Charlie Hines had said about Bart Compton, oh, how hateful. The humiliation came back in wave on wave, in merciless rhythm to the clatter of the train. She made a brave show of her homecoming, though nobody was there to greet her but Sloan and Edith and me. Sloan had fed us, and she said, there's a plate for you in the oven, Helen. But my mother said she'd rather have a drink instead. She was then at the onset of a long battle with alcohol that she would ultimately lose. It must have seemed bracing that night to decide on a drink instead of dinner. And she told us all about her trip to Washington, managing to make it sound like a success. She told us how thrilling it was to be actually inside the White House. She repeated whatever small, courteous thing it was that President Roosevelt had said to her on receiving the head. And she had brought back souvenirs. A handful of note-sized White House stationery for Edith, and a well-used briar pipe for me. She explained that she'd seen a very distinguished-looking man smoking the pipe in the waiting room outside the Oval Office. When his name was called, he knocked it out quickly into an ashtray and left there as he hurried inside. She'd waited until she was sure that no one was looking. Then she'd taken the pipe from the ashtray and put it into her purse. Because I knew he must have been somebody important, she said. He could easily have been a member of the cabinet or something like that. Anyway, I thought you'd have a lot of fun with it. But I didn't. It was too heavy to hold in my teeth, and it tasted terrible when I sucked on it. Besides, I kept wondering what the man must have thought when he came out of the president's office and found it gone. Sloan went home after a while, and my mother sat drinking alone at the dining room table. I think she hoped Howard Whitman or some of her other friends might drop in, but nobody did. It was almost our bedtime when she looked up and said, Edith, run out in the garden and see if you can find Bart. He had recently bought a pair of bright tan shoes with crepe soles. I saw those shoes trip rapidly down the dark brick steps beyond the windows. He seemed scarcely to touch each step in his buoyancy. And then I saw him come smiling into the studio with Edith, closing the door behind him. Helen, he said, you're back. She acknowledged she was back. She got up from the table and slowly advanced on him, and Edith and I began to realize we were in for something bad. Bart, she said, I had lunch with Charlie Hines in Washington today. Oh? And we had a very interesting talk. He seems to know you very well. Oh, not really. We've met a few times at Howard's, but we're not really. And he said you told him the depression was over for you because you found some rich, dumb, crazy woman who was paying you to tutor her kids. Don't interrupt me. But Bart clearly had no intention of interrupting her. He was backing away from her in his soundless shoes, retreating past one stiff garden child after another. His face looked startled and pink. I'm not a rich woman, Bart, she said, bearing down on him. And I'm not dumb, and I'm not crazy, and I know vision. I can recognize ingratitude and disloyalty and sheer rotten viciousness and lies when they're thrown in my face. My sister and I were halfway up the stair, jostling each other in our need to hide before the worst part came. The worst part of these things always came at the end, after she'd lost all control and gone on shouting anyway. I want you to get out of my house, Bart, she said, and I don't ever want to see you again. And I want to tell you something. All my life I've hated people who say some of my best friends are Jews, because none of my friends are Jews or ever will be. Do you understand me? None of my friends are Jews or ever will be. The studio was quiet after that, without speaking, avoiding each other's eyes. Edith and I got into our pajamas and into bed. But it wasn't more than a few minutes before the house began to ring with our mother's raging voice all over again, as if Bart had somehow been brought back and made to take his punishment twice. And I said, none of my friends are Jews or ever will be. She was on the phone, on the telephone, giving Sloan Cabinet the highlights of the scene, and it was clear that Sloan would take her side and comfort her. Sloan might know how the Virgin Mary felt on the way to Bethlehem, but she also knew how to play my stutter for laughs. In a case like this, she would quickly see where her allegiance lay, and it wouldn't cost her much to drop Bart Campin from her enchanted circle. When the telephone call came to an end at last, there was silence downstairs until we heard her working with the ice pick in the icebox. She was making herself another drink. There would be no more school in our room. We would probably never see Bart again, or if we did, he would probably not want to see us. But our mother was ours, we were hers, and we lived with that knowledge as we lay listening for the faint sounds of millions. Thank you.